Hi, I'm Corinne Wells of Franny B Quilt Company, and welcome to week 5 of the Eclipse Quilt Along. For the last 5 weeks, we have been putting together these beautiful Eclipse blocks where we are featuring what it might look like if we were to show an eclipse in quilt form. So our focal print here is the moon. We have the rays of the sun peeking out behind it, and we have the background of the sky, and our eclipse quilt blocks are complete. So you may have at this point already decided to trim your block to 12.5 inches square. If you haven't and you would like to, now is the time to do that. And then you will need your sashing pieces and your cornerstone star pieces that should have been previously cut. When you have your sashing and your cornerstone star pieces, you will be assembling them together to make your sashing units. So you can set aside, if you are going to trim your blocks, trim them, make sure they're all sewn and pressed, trimmed if you're going to, and then you can set them aside and we'll move forward to creating our sashing units. So the first step to sewing your sashing units and creating the cornerstone stars will be to start with just one of your sashing strips and one of your smaller cornerstone star squares. These are going to lay right sides together in one of the corners of your strip. These should be non-directional strips, so it won't really matter which corner you choose to use. Then we will be stitching just like we did on our moon blocks. We snowballed the corners and then used the stitch and flip to flip it over. We're going to be doing that exact same thing on these strips, on each of the 4 corners. If you are someone who likes to mark, you can grab a ruler, and on each of these little squares, you would line your ruler up from corner to corner and mark a line, and then you can sew along that line. Or if you're like me, you can just use your seam guide or a piece of washi tape to help you visualize that imaginary line from corner to corner. In fact, with these little squares, it's a little bit easier to visualize it and to keep it in line so you don't have to mark that. I also need to point out, if you are chain piecing, that you will need to be careful about the order in which you chain. Theoretically, you could chain piece everything all at once. However, I find that when my chain gets too long, it becomes unwieldy and a little bit difficult to work with. So I like to work with a little bit smaller chains, and then I do one corner. In the pattern, it shows that you would do a corner and then the corner at the opposite end, but on the same side. That's how it's written in the pattern. However, if you are chain piecing, you may find it convenient to either sew one corner at a time and then trim and press and then move on to the next corner. Or if you want to try chain piecing 2 at a time, then instead of moving to the corner opposite but on the same side, I would actually go to the corner diagonal from your first pressing. That way they can be subsequently chained without overlapping or getting in the way too much. So let me show you how I have done that. So you can see here that I have chain pieced one corner, and then I have also flipped it around and chain pieced the opposite corner. This allows it to feed through the machine nice and straight, and then you get 2 corners before you get your ruler out. I like doing this because it's efficient, and then I can grab my ruler and I can trim and press those at the same time. Depending on how long your chain is, you may choose to use a longer ruler, but keep in mind that sometimes these little pieces can get a little bit fiddly and it's hard to keep it all exactly on the same seam line. So I actually prefer, even when I have a longer chain, to use my 1/4 inch ruler, something like this, that is a little shorter, and I can make sure that every single strip is precisely trimmed before moving on to the next one. So I would just start by trimming 1 or 2 at a time and then move on to the next few. Maybe you can get 3 that are nice and straight and trim all of those corners off. And then you will move on to pressing these open. After these have all been trimmed and pressed, then you would trim them apart and attach the next squares. Do not attach this next door neighbor square to the corner until it has been trimmed and pressed open, or else your seam allowances are going to get in the way of each other and it's not going to work as nicely. So after you have your strips, you've cut them all apart from that chain, then stack them all together, and then you'll do the same thing. You'll line up you'll treat this as if it's just a normal corner, and then line up your next corner square on the corner, and you will again chain piece this, or rather sew this, and if you are chain piecing, you would do all of this corner on all of the strips and then move to all of this corner on all of the strips. And then you would trim them, press all of them open. Then this is what you're going to end up with. You're going to end up with this somewhat arrow looking strip where the corners have all been snowballed, and these are going to be contributing to the cornerstone star look. And you'll line these up with the edge of your block, and it will be your sashing. So mine, you can see that sashing blends in with my background. I did that intentionally so that my bright white stars can pop off the most. When you have your sashing units completed, you'll then be taking these larger squares and using them to anchor the 2 sashing units to make your cornerstone star. Each of these units will be sewn to the sides of every single block, and then you will make a strip of sashing units that will be sewn in between. And when sewn together, it will make a completed star. So to the sides of every block, you'll be sewing these sashing units, and then you'll also have a nice long strip of the sashing units that will help create the cornerstone star. So to help you to visualize how that will look, I have sewn these together with that sashing unit. So you have a sashing unit in between each of the blocks, and all you would see in this row are these 2 snowballed corners here at the top and at the bottom. But then you will also have a strip of sashing that will go between those rows, and it will line up precisely to make a star. And then to show you even greater effect, I'll take this sashing unit and lay it up there, and you can see that completed star, which is really fun to see between all of the blocks. So go ahead, and in order, what you will be doing is first you will be snowballing the corners of your sashing units. Get all of these strips snowballed and stacked together. When they have all been snowballed, then you move on and sew 1 sashing unit next to every single block. Now, before doing this, I recommend laying all of your blocks out on the floor or someplace where you have a nice big area. Lay your quilt out and take a picture of it and make sure that you like how it looks before you begin sewing. I like to sew 1 sashing unit to the left side of every single block. Then I take a sashing unit and I sew it to the right side of 1 of each of my square blocks. And I do that after I've laid this out and taken a picture, so I know each color that needs to have 2 sashing units sewn to it. Then it's much easier to just sew each of my block, treat my block and my sashing unit that have been sewn together, I treat them as one and I sew them together in a row to create my block row. Then I sew the remaining sashing units together with these cornerstone squares to create the cornerstone stars. And there will be a square on each end as well. So you'll have 4 sashing units and a square on both ends of each. So 4 sashing units and 5 squares. And then we will line it up and we will sew those together in rows. So create your sashing units, figure out the layout that you want to have, and sew each of your sashing units to the sides of your blocks. Pay very special attention if you have used directional prints in your focal print. This is now where it's going to be critical that you lay them in the right direction. If you paid attention to it as you were sewing together your background, then you can decide that maybe the tops of all of your blocks have the square background pieces, or maybe the tops of all of your blocks have the rectangle pieces. If you didn't pay attention to that, it shouldn't be a big deal because these are non-directional background pieces, or they should be, and so it won't really matter whether you have it this way or this way. But it does matter now that you're putting it together with your sashing pieces. If you're sewing this to the side, and really if you're sewing it to the left side, then you're deciding that the direction is up at this point. So if you have a pattern going to the side, make sure that you turn it because that's going to be important. That's also why I like to sew my sashing units to every single piece on the left side, because that reminds me this side is up. So if I have directional prints here, then it's going to keep me honest and it's going to keep them moving in the right direction. I do love having directional prints in this block because it is so large. It can show off some of those really fun hero prints, but you just don't want to mess it up and have something that's supposed to be right side up laying to the side or upside down. So just make note of that. Take special care after your sashing units are all sewn. You've laid out your pattern, then make sure that you sew the sashing unit to the left side of every single block. Then on the blocks that are going to be on the right side of the quilt, you will sew an additional sashing unit to the right side. So most of your blocks will be just a sashing unit on the left. The right side row, just these 5 blocks, will have it sewn on the right and the left. As soon as you're done with that, we'll move on to putting the rows together. See you soon. Another way that can help you visualize how you want to lay your quilt is to turn back to the back of the pattern. Whether you have the printed pattern or the PDF pattern, you should have access to a coloring page. This is where the coloring page can come in handy because you can just color in those center blocks and help you get a better idea of how you want them to be laid out. If you'd like to, you could even make several copies of this and try a few different versions or a few different variations until you like how it looks. So for example, on this cover here, I have blocks that are red, yellow, blue, and white. So I might just take a red, yellow, and blue marker or colored pencil and just color it solid red. And maybe you want them all to go in a diagonal, or maybe you want them to be a little bit more random. These coloring pages can help you visualize that a little bit more easily. Once you have your vision and you have attached your sashing units to the side of all of your focal print blocks, then go ahead and lay it out in a way where you can visualize the entire quilt and even take a picture of it and look at that picture on your phone and make sure that you really like how it's laid out. Once you're sure that you like it, then go ahead and gather up each of the rows into their own little stack so that you know which rows you're going to be sewing together. So you can see here that I'm collecting these right sides together so I know which seams I'm going to be sewing together. After that, you'll have each of your rows that you're sewing together, and you're going to want to attach the horizontal sashing units to the tops of each row. And I personally like to attach just a couple of rows together at a time so that it's not quite so unwieldy under my sewing machine. So you can see here that I'm attaching my row to one horizontal sashing unit at a time, and then I will sew 2 together and then 3 together and attach the whole thing. And then celebrate because your quilt top is finished and now you get to take it out for a cute little photo shoot if you would like to. I always love taking pictures of just the quilt top before it's quilted because it is another step. It takes a little bit more time to get your quilt quilted, and being able to celebrate, take some pictures, throw them up on social media, show your friends that you made a quilt. It's kind of a fun little palette cleanser before you jump into quilting. This concludes our video series of the Eclipse Quilt Along. If you would like to keep following along and get tips and tricks about how to quilt your quilt and how to bind it, then please click the link in the profile to join the email series if you haven't already and have instructions sent straight to your inbox. Thanks again for joining me in the Eclipse Quilt Along. Come and find me on Instagram at FrannyBQuiltCo and tag me with your beautiful quilt. Talk to you soon.